Well, it's one of these lovely West Coast days in which the snow is falling and the land is turning magically white. And we're going to do a short presentation on my recent book on Erasmus called Wild Bird. I've lived with Erasmus for many years, and in many ways he's a bird that could not be caged intellectually. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, if you want to escape from one cage, be aware you're not going into another cage. So if you want to tell me what you want to be free from, I'm equally interested in what you want to be free for. And that for may just be taking you into another cage. And so the title of my recent book, Erasmus, Wild Bird, is, I use that metaphor consciously so in that he refused to be caged by any of the theological, the philosophical, the liturgical, the ecclesial traditions of his time, political, economic, some of the forces that fought by night militarily, but he also remained committed. So he was a person who was grounded, but he also recognized the limitations, the finitude, the fallibility of both thought and action, but he also stood within a tradition while not idealizing or absolutizing it. And so my book, Erasmus, Wild Bird, looks at the elusive and nimble nature of Erasmus, who was quite unlike Luther in many ways. It was often said of Erasmus he could walk on eggshells and not break them, whereas Luther, every eggshell he stepped on, he crushed, and he often killed what was inside of it in terms of fragmenting the church and disagreeing with other theologians and exegetes at a variety of levels. I want to just briefly touch 10 points in this presentation, which will come from Erasmus, Wild Bird. And then hopefully those of you who see this may be interested. It might whet your palate to pick up the book from Amazon. It only sells for about 8 books, and of course it welcome people who could do a review and post them on Amazon. The first thing I'd like to mention is there's quite an interest these days in spirituality, the contemplative, the meditative traditions. But one of the dilemmas of this interest, it is often gets stuck or frozen in the inward life, meditative practices, studying the classics of spirituality, bringing big name people in, but it doesn't translate the contemplative, the meditative, the spiritual into the political or the public realm. And in that sense, it's a modern form of neo-Gnosticism. And Gnosticism, classical, was spirit was good, matter was evil. Our modern forms of neo-Gnosticism is which thinking or the inner life or the journey to God is primary, but we don't deal with the public, the political, the economic. And this is just a modern form of prettied up Gnosticism. And so this often gap between spirituality, contemplative, meditative traditions that do not become public or political would be something that Erasmus would find highly problematic in terms of an organic or an integrated view of the faith journey. You'll often see the same tradition also in forms of biblical exegesis, in which we exegete what Paul thought in the past, what John thought, what prophets may have thought, but what's the relevance of that to public issues in time and history that we live with today. Erasmus was quite competent in exegeting great texts, but he also knew how to apply them to the 16th century in which he lived and the issues of theology, philosophy, political issues, war and peace issues, economic issues. He was probably the greatest scholar of his day, and he could go toe for toe with anyone on exegetical issues, but he also shuttled back and forth between biblical thought, patristic thought, and the contemporary issues of the 16th century. Also, I would say theology also often suffers from this fate, in that one can talk about the relationship of Father, Son, Spirit, the nature of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the communion of saints. But what's that have to do with the pressing issues that we face today in our time, whether war and peace issues, ecological issues, Pride and Prejudice, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, many of these key perennial issues that if theology is not facing it, it's really not the Word of God in terms of the living logos that speaks into the present historic context. And in this particular time at Christmas, where the Word is made flesh, if theology is not made flesh, if the logos is not made flesh, then it's a form of neo-Gnosticism in that sense. And so much of the contemplative tradition or the mystical theology, exegesis, as long as it does not sally forth into the world of history and time and public life, is in one sense it embodies a modern form of Gnosticism. And this is something that Erasmus in his time would have been opposed to. And it's not that he didn't write great works on spirituality. He did. He was probably one of the most insightful writers on the mystical tradition and spirituality and layered ways of reading the Bible and applying it to the transformation of the human journey. But he also saw that if that transformation didn't move out into the public and political realm, that it was a form of escapism, or what Marx would call an opiate in that sense. So the first point I want to mention is that we must be very wary when engaging in theology, exegesis, the contemplative traditions, which are abundant these days, that we don't turn our backs on the public, the political, and some of these big perennial themes that the great prophets spoke about in their time, and certainly Erasmus dealt with in his time. The second point I'd like to mention is that often, and the book covers this, Erasmus Wildbird, is that often people study the history of political philosophy at universities. They'll go from Plato, they'll study the Laws, Republic, Statesman, Gorgias, a variety of Aristotle's works. They'll perhaps light down on Cicero, Seneca. They'll move to Augustine, Aquinas. Then they move into Machiavelli, Locke, Hobbes, Mill, and often then postmodern thinkers, Foucault, Derrida, people like that. But they do a leapfrog over two of the most important public philosophers of the 16th century, Thomas More and Erasmus. And Erasmus and More are very significant because they embody a very different tradition of Christians doing political philosophy, which is irenical. It's grappling with the larger issues of justice and injustice, war and peace. Anyone who reads More's Utopia, for example, it's perennially relevant. And so people then, if they don't study Erasmus or More, they get a distort, and they also miss, for example, Richard Hooker, also who was the great Elizabethan political theologian. They get a distorted understanding of the nuanced and subtle nature of Christian political philosophy as it worked itself out in the 16th century. So in that sense, is what Alan Bloom talks about, the closing of the American mind. If people don't study the great works, and particularly the irenical, the peacemakers, the theological peacemakers of their time, their minds are closed in that sense, in terms of a bigger understanding or a bigger openness in terms of what political philosophy should be. The third point I would make is that many Christians, sadly so, can do, particularly if they're curious and interested and committed to their faith, they are quite keen on studying theology, biblical exegesis, creeds, confessions, the contemplative life, but you have very, very few Christians who actually are well trained in political philosophy. And one might ask why. And this is, again, I think it comes back to a form of subtle neo-Gnosticism, that as long as we're studying the Bible, as long as we're studying the Fathers, as long as we're studying creeds, as long as we're studying councils, as long as we're studying confessions, then somehow we're closer to the core and the hub of Christianity. And political philosophy, political science, sociology, why would one go there in terms of an understanding of faith? And so what we've got, we're often in a context in which many Christians are bereft of an ability to think seriously about political philosophy and its relevance for us today, and the history of political thought in terms of how Christians have understood that and the relationship to it. When that doesn't occur, then you have people polarizing into cages in that sense. Well, I'm Republican, or I'm Democrat, or I'm NDP, or I'm conservative, or liberal, or I'm green, depending on the country one lives in North America. And so when people are not trained to be nimble and subtle and thoughtful in the areas of historic political philosophy, then they get caged. And in that sense, Erasmus is a wonderful mentor and model in terms of doing political philosophy in a wise and sagacious manner, because he gives people the tools to think through how to make sense of political life at the level of principle, at the level of practice, at the level of parties, and the level of policy, and what that can mean and the consequences of it. Because he lived right in the thick of these issues, but as I have mentioned a few times, he would not be caged by any ideology of what we would call today the right, left, or center in no sense of the word. And so the fourth point I'll make here then is that the 16th century in which Erasmus lived has a lot of affinities with the early decades of the 21st century in which we live. Immense fragmentation occurring at the time, the different interpretations of how you read the Bible, how one interprets theology, how one makes sense of this in terms of ecclesiology. So we can see, obviously, with Luther, and then with Calvin, the Reformed tradition, the Anabaptist, the Protestant tradition is beginning to fragment, fighting and defining what the authentic form of faith is. You get the Tridentine tradition of the Roman Catholic tradition. Again, they defining what authentic faith is historically. And we can see the same thing happening today in terms of the various postmodern splinters, the defense of neo-Calvinism against postmodernism, liberalism against Calvinism. So all of these internal Christian debates, intellectually, theologically, philosophically, liturgically, ecclesially, were front and center in the 16th century. And there are those who get caged. They get caged into intellectual systems, exegetical systems, theological systems. And in that sense, Erasmus can act as a real model and mentor of beware of being caged, because we're meant to be free as people of faith, and the dangers and the temptations of saluting to a particular tribe in the Christian faith. And so in that sense, Erasmus models a way of transcending the tribalism of his time, both theologically, philosophically, politically, ecclesially, in many ways. And he paid the price for it. And there is a price for being a peacemaker. As the Reformation emerged, it seemed that Erasmus was far more critical of the Roman Catholic Church than was Luther. So it looked like well, it was said he laid the egg that Luther hatched. And it looked like he was moving in the direction of Protestantism and where Luther was going. And so most Protestants thought, this is our boy. He's going to be leading to the critique, the separation of the Roman Catholic Church. So he seemed more Protestant than Catholic. On the other hand, as Luther and Calvin began the schismatic nature of the church, he remained very loyal and critical to the Roman Catholic Church, but the Roman Catholic Church turned on him. And in fact, by Trent, he was put on the index, and Erasmus was on the index really from Trent right up to Vatican II, when Pope John essentially sprung loose his many works again and said these are valid works of the church. So in Erasmus in the 16th century, he really offers a way, if a person is attempting flying free from the cages of ideology, there is a price to pay for that, and trying to tell the truth that transcends the various tribes. They'll often be shot at and rejected or treated indifferently or betrayed by all sides. So he lived in this very difficult place between being Catholic, but many Catholics, particularly the Catholic Sanhedrin, critiquing him. And of course, when Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, he was very mixed about what do you do with Erasmus, and in many at times saying yes, other times saying no. And then the Jesuits themselves, many of the Jesuits then, as a part of Trent, became very critical of Erasmus. And of course, there were other Jesuits that were for, but he became a very controversial figure, as was Origen and Clement in the early church. And then, as I said, the Protestants saw him as one of them, but because he didn't become Protestant, they rejected him. And so Erasmus, in that sense, offers us a model of how to avoid being caged, but the price of freedom as well, and what that costs. The next point I'd like to make would be the issue of Islam, which would be the fifth point. In the 16th century, late 15th century, Constantinople had been sacked by the Muslims, and there was the great fear, of course, that Islam was coming in through Eastern Europe, Austria, coming up to Italy. The great fear that the aggressive form of Islam was going to take over the West, obviously in Spain, where Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492 had expelled the Muslims. They took a very hard line against the Muslims, very similar to the political right today, and where you see the Muslims as a reaction to the Andalusian tradition in Spain. And so Erasmus again was taking a position in which do you follow the inquisitory nature, Inquisition type of Spain of Ferdinand and Isabella, Or can we look at Islam in a different way than just seen as the great threat to the West and destroying the West in any means? And then again, you see the ironical nature of Erasmus when read at a layered level in terms of how he's dealing with Islam, in opposed to the very right-wing hawkish approach to Islam, which we see played out very, very much today amongst the political, which doesn't mean he was what we would call today a naive liberal in terms of Islam either. He was acutely aware that it was a mixed tradition, but he was even more acutely aware that his own Christian tradition could be violent also, and at times more violent. And of course, back of him was the Inquisition, the Crusades, and all of that. So to excessively critique the Muslims for being violent, he would say, well, look at our own faith. Crusades, Inquisitions, a huge amount of violence. So it's a bit like the pot calling the kettle black in that sense. So when we think of Erasmus, and he was a wild bird, he didn't buy into the standard interpretations of Islam. Next point I just wanted to mention was the Erasmus's way of seeing. There are two tendencies in doing theology and exegesis, and there are others also, but the two dominant ones are an excessively dogmatic way. This is the way you interpret the text. This is the way you interpret the fathers. This is the way you interpret the creeds. This is the way, and if you differ, that proves you're heterodox. Erasmus was acutely aware that we are all finite. We're fallen, we see through a gas darkly, and so rather than a dogmatic read of the text, the fathers, the creeds, his was a dialogical tradition, recognizing there are layered ways, there's different reads within the Western and Eastern traditions. So let us listen to that conversation throughout history and not be excessively dogmatic in terms of how we approach it. So his more dialogical read was bringing in the voice of the communion of the saints in this historic dialogical tradition, and out of that a healthy Catholic Church, as it were, Catholic, a cataholis according to the whole, would emerge. And so this underlying, it's almost epistemology or hermeneutic of Erasmus was one which was deeply dialogical, because he recognized the logos, or the word, only came alive in the context of the communion of the saints, listening to one another historically, and what that meant in the context that they lived in at any given time. So the next one would be then, in terms of Erasmus and orthodoxy, again, with the destruction of Constantinople in the 15th century, many of the Orthodox, in fact, were coming into the West, bringing their manuscripts and their texts. And so Erasmus was at the forefront of translating some of the best of the Eastern Fathers, in terms of the relevance, in terms of a dialogue with the Western Fathers. So again, we're back into this dialogical tradition. What are the various ways of reading Eastern Fathers? What's the best translations? How do you annotate them? And how do they enter into conversation with the Western Fathers? And again, what stood back of Erasmus was a schism between the Orient and the Occident, between Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, as there was between emerging Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. So again, the ironical dialogical exegete, theologian, philosopher of Erasmus, he's constantly looking for the higher vision, and he's not trapped in cages, ecclesially, theologically, philosophically, politically, which is important to understand him as a prophet in his time, in one sense, in terms of the way he thinks and is a visionary for our time in some ways. I also touched on, and I'll conclude with this, there's many other things I could say about my book, Erasmus Wildboar, but I spent time in 1973-74 at Le Brie. I was in the Waymo Villars one in Switzerland with Francis and Edith Schaeffer. And I was always taken at the time, by the way, Farrell House was the main center where you did your studying and read the lectures of Schaeffer and many Os Guinness and a variety of other Reformed theologians of the time. But William Farrell was one of the most, as it were, he was like Calvin on steroids in Switzerland. But he was a hero hero to the Schaeffers. And on the other hand, Erasmus was seen as the problem. He was the humanist. He was the Renaissance humanist who you couldn't trust. And Erasmus opposed Luther, and Calvin wasn't exactly on the same page as Erasmus. It was those Renaissance humanists which paved the way for the secular Enlightenment, so the argument went, and so you couldn't trust those humanists, and of which Erasmus was the reigning king in many ways. So there was this dualism created at L'Abri that demeaned the language of humanism as something negative and held high the Reformed tradition of Calvin, Farel, and many others, the 16th century, and then you fast forward that to many Reformed thinkers in the 20th and 21st century. And so this approach to Erasmus, he has often been undermined, marginalized, subordinated, not only within the Roman Catholic tradition being put in the index, but many within the Lutheran Reformed tradition often see him as highly problematic, and so he's been marginalized once again. He refused, as it were, to flutter into the cage of any theological system, and so anyone who's caged within an intellectual system doesn't know what to do with the wild bird of Erasmus. And I think the way forward, certainly for people of faith today, is to find those theologians, those exegetes, who do not allow themselves to be caged within a system of thought, of philosophy, of ecclesiology, while still being rooted also, because the danger is on the one hand, I won't be caged, therefore I'm committed to nothing. Well, that's not Erasmus's way either. He was deeply rooted in a historic tradition, but he knew how to critique it charitably, graciously, while being committed, but asking the hard questions at the same time. And that's always more difficult, how to be critical but loyal. Some people are loyal but not critical. Other people are critical but loyal to nothing other than criticism itself, which is not very helpful, and that's tendency of the postmodern dilemma itself. So in that sense, Erasmus can offer a way of thinking how to do theology, politics, ecclesiology, literature, liturgy, and many other areas, and also drawing deeply from the well of the tradition. This is another great weakness that, of course, we see in many people today. They're not grounded in anything historically. So if you ask many people today, tell me what you've read of Plato and Aristotle, and the wisdom of the past, it just doesn't exist for most people. And same with the communion of the saints. And it is that thousands of years of history, of tradition, and the voice of the past as we listen to it dialogically that gives us a way to think forward. As Hugh of St. Victor once said, if we stand on the shoulders of those that have gone before us, we can see further than they. We draw from their wisdom. But people who have no sense of history or tradition, or are not immersed in the great conversation of the past, one, they often just then repeat the issues at a much sillier and more shallow level. They become sort of voyeurs and dilettantes without any depth or history. Whereas Erasmus, he gave his life to the languages. He gave himself to the texts. He gave himself to the reflections on the text. So he brings a richness and a fullness of the true Catholic understanding of the faith. And in that sense, he again he can't be caged, even though, as I mentioned earlier, many wanted to pet him and pat him and say, he's our man, he's the guy that will point us forward. But he knew that this was just another form of being caged, and he would fly from such flattery in that sense of caging him. So my book, Erasmus, Wild Bird, is really, I use the metaphor of wild bird. In one sense, it's a reflection of Tennyson's poems. Our little systems have their day, they have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, O Lord, art more than they. So Erasmus is aware of the nature of the broken light nature of knowing, and then how we can hear, heed, dialogically work with a couple of thousand years of history and making sense of the big issues we face today, whether ecological, political, war, peace issues, justice issues, theological issues, exegetical issues, liturgical issues, that are all part of a healthy and a whole journey onwards in terms of the faith tradition.